Okay, so we are now moving to our next topic of the course in Ethnic Studies 101, and that's how the categories of gender, sexuality intersect with ethnic studies. And something I want to say here is that sure, ethnic studies deals frontally with race and ethnicity in the United States, but ethnic studies, as scholars who work in this discipline argue that you can't really isolate race by itself on its own, especially when we're thinking about things like social justice and the distribution of wealth and income, and the institutional racism. Okay, what we need to really understand, according to academics in the field, is that race and ethnicities actually, rather than being on its own, intersects with other types of identities. Okay, and here we're going to focus mostly on gender and sexuality, but as this slide suggests here, you can look at these various categories here that deal with identity. You have sexuality and gender here, but also abilities or disabilities, right? Location, socioeconomic status. You could also call that social class. Certainly ethnicity and race is mentioned. Language, even, and age, right? Think of ageism, for example. All right, so what we're talking about here is that all these classes intersect, and we're going to speak in considerable depth of this idea of intersectionality in a second. But one thing I want to emphasize here that connects what I just mentioned is that scholars look at these as interconnected. Okay, it's important to note that it's not just connected. If, for example, with race, you could discuss things that are or issues that relate to race, but ultimately we see the cause of, let's say, for example, institutional racism and other issues related to race. We see the cause as invariably connecting with other issues besides race, like gender, class, or sexuality. Okay, so the whole idea is interconnection, that these categories like gender, class, and sexuality are not mutually exclusive to each other. Okay, so this is kind of the I'll be honest, in academics you usually see race, gender, and class. Okay, if you take another class in the humanities, literature class, sociology, philosophy, you'll see race, gender, class. Okay, but you could pretty much subsume sexuality under gender, as many people do in academia. Okay, so the whole idea here is that race, gender, and class are imbricated or interconnected, right? And ultimately, in the identity that one's assumed based on these categories, it wields an enormous effect on one's social location in society. Okay, it shapes one's position in society. That is to say, it could marginalize you, or it could centralize you. In other words, you'll be typical, right? Or it could privilege you, right? Think, for example, of, let's look at race, gender, class, and sexuality. Think, for example, of race, let's think of Caucasian or white. Gender, let's think of male. Class, let's think of 1% wealthy, okay, the 1%, so to speak, right? And sexuality, let's think of heterosexual, okay? You put all those together and you think of an individual. Imagine an individual. And you could almost bet that this person, right, is going to be located pretty much on the upper echelons of society in the United States, right? If you look at the stratification system, meaning, how people of different classes are located, or excuse me, are, location, based on, let's say, a vertical axis, right, or even a pyramid, we notice that those on the very top, and that's why they're called 1%, right? They usually benefit from ideas that race, gender, sexual class, and sexuality. Now, that's not to say that, let's say African American or Indian American or what have you, gender, let's say women, and sexuality, let's say, homosexuality rather than hetero, right? Well, that doesn't mean that, they can't be part of the 1%. Of course it doesn't. Okay. But what it's being argued here is that it wields an enormous influence in actually shaping, not determining. Okay. Determining means 100%, influence, but certainly shaping one's position in society. Okay. Now, I introduced earlier this idea of power, right? How social scientists, rather than looking at human interactions in a neutral way, many of them look at it as embedded in power relations, right? So, in other words, when your positionality, to use the fancy academic term, when your positionality is actually shaped by, let's say, race, gender, class, it's invariably the case that, with the infusion of power relations in this relationship, right, it's going to, again, wield an effect on the distribution of wealth, of income, of prestige, of, so on and so forth, right? Asset accumulation, influence in society, think about all the ways that, power manifests itself, right? Okay, so all of these are interwoven, again, to determine one's social location, okay? And this is going to bring us to the next category, which is intersectionality. All right. Now, here's one of the scholars. There were two African American women, actually, and I believe this goes back to the 80s, if I remember correctly. Okay, maybe the 90s, but Kimberly Crenshaw was enormous influence in this notion of intersectionality, and now it's pretty much standard in the academic world, right? When you'll study this in sociology, social sciences, so on and so forth, literature, and other disciplines. But Kimberly Crenshaw, who, by the way, much of this work is subsumed under today what has been called critical race theory. Okay, and if you know, and if you've been keeping attention with the political climate, you know how that was sort of political football that's around. It's been, weaponized by some parts of the political spectrum, and it's been, criticized. When in fact it's been around since the 90s, so it's almost inexplicable how something that's been around for decades is all of a sudden, controversial, right? In any case, Kimberly Crenshaw was a pioneer in what's now called critical race theory. By the way, critical race theory, its beginnings as an academic subdiscipline is, mostly legal. Okay, it's not just this general idea of teaching race and ethnicity as it's somehow put forth today. Okay, putting that aside, yeah, Crenshaw was a big influence in quote-unquote critical race theory. She was a legal scholar, okay, and what she did is, here's the way she examined some court cases when she was actually studying, I believe she was in law school, okay, but she was studying court cases that were held by African American women. And here's what she discovered in her investigation. She looked at some court case whereby, African American women, in this case it was an industry that basically terminated the employment of African American women in disproportionate numbers. okay, because the industry was starting to fall under. And these women, African American women, of course, noticed that, hey, how come African American women are being let go and other people aren't? Why is it African American women, right? So they basically sued, and when this entered the court system, the jurists that were, looking at this and adjudicating it, basically operated along what you could call a single axis framework. Okay, a single axis framework, AXIS, single axis framework. This is what Crenshaw stated here. That was her terminology. And what does she mean by that? She means that, let's say you had a judge who was looking at the case brought forth by the black women, and the judge said, well, listen, when we look in terms of, African Americans, at that particular industry that they used to be employed under, we see that black men, African American men, were doing good. All right, so it can't be an issue of race, the judge says. And similarly, when we look at women in the industry that the black women used to belong to, they noticed that white women were doing good. So the judge said, well, that means women are treated okay. It's not a matter of discrimination based on sex or gender. All right, so the judge, if you could imagine, is operating along what Crenshaw referred to as a single axis framework. That is to say, he or she, I'm not sure what it was, but he or she was thinking of them separately, right? Rather than it being interwoven, like I discussed earlier, right? This idea of things being interconnected, right? And basically, there was no way in the law, according to that particular judge, that you could analyze it as this identity being compounded by different categories, right? They separated the two to analyze the case of the black women, right? So this obviously opened the eyes of Crenshaw, and she introduced this notion of intersectionality to describe what's going on here, how in this case African American women were being discriminated upon based on this identities compounded, right, with each other. All right, so as stated there, intersectionality is the framework by which to analyze how multiple identities interconnect and overlap with each other in shaping one's position in society. All right. Now, this, as you can see here in this illustration, and similar to the other one I showed you, involves level of education, sexuality, sexual orientation, ability, or lack of disability, age, gender, of course, ethnicity, of course, culture, let's say religion, right? Language, right? Class. So there's all these things that are, ways of thinking about your identity, all right? And again, the whole idea behind intersectionality is that they overlap, they interconnect, they, to use a term, they co-construct each other. Okay, meaning it's not just the sum of these categories. Okay, it's not just saying, oh, just add up all these categories together, and that's your, or just conceptualize them, whether it's race, education, sexuality, ability, age, and so forth, and then just put them all together, and that's your identity. It's not just the sum of that. They actually co-construct each other, right? They work to construct each other. Okay. And again, similar to what I just argued, intersectionality, argues that those categories shape one's experiences and one's social reality. So that's what's important about intersectionality. Okay, is that you can't think of it as just identity politics. In other words, as I mentioned, just the sum of these things. It actually goes deeper than that because it argues that these categories, again, um, in its lived reality, right? Let's remember how race has a social reality. Well, this is very similar too, in that these other identities have social realities. What they do is actually co-construct, again, to use my earlier term, meaning that they're not constructed separately, right? These identities, and then you just put them all together, you sandwich them all together. No, it's they all are interwoven, right, and interconnected. All right. So that's the notion of intersectionality. And now we're going to move on to gender and sexuality. The next slide.